Our next speaker is Tamra Allen, who is the planning manager for Garfield County. And I don't want to show favoritism as the moderator too much for Garfield County, but I can tell you that in terms of the way we frame this, the topic of this discussion today, I think Garfield County in many ways is on the forefront of having dynamic land use code. And part of that is not just being quickly reacting, but being proactive. Garfield County has come up with an operator's navigation guide. So earlier it was talked about that when a new company comes to town, they may not know the code very well. Well, this document was perspective, looking forward, how do we solve that? You know, within a 30-minute read, they can kind of get a grasp on how to navigate the land use code. And that's just one example that I know. I've had the pleasure of working closely with Tamara on, and many other things. You can take a look at her bio on page 12 there and see that she's worked pretty much in every facet within the county, has breadth of experience. She's tough when she needs to be, compromises when it makes sense, and always willing to work with our industry to come to constructive solutions. So please welcome Tamara Allen. She's going to talk to us about water and how technology over time has affected Garfield County and their land use code. So welcome, Tamara Allen.
Thank you, David. That was a very gracious introduction. As you can tell from what David just said, we have spent a fair bit of time in the room together over plates of cookies, glasses of water, hours and hours of hearings and otherwise, trying to come to good solutions. And really, the topic here in front of you, trying to figure out how to keep our land use code at the county up to speed and up to pace with what's going on with industry. Again, thank you. With that, I want to say a couple of things. I actually want to understand who my audience is here a little bit. I want to see a show of hands on who either represents or works for a regulatory agency. That's local government. Okay, and who all is from industry? Great, not as many as I had hoped today. But good nonetheless. I'm glad you're here. So what I want to talk about is a little bit more kind of in the weeds. I think we got our feet wet a little bit with our last two topics. Thank you, Todd and Tom. But wanted to kind of dive in a little bit more to be as punny as I can today and talk about water management. When I was looking back to see what kind of code modifications we've done over the last handful of years, it's really been focused on what's going on with water. How are we managing water? How is industry treating water, especially in this area where we have an excess of it. Which way? So if you didn't know where you're at today, this is where you're at. Garfield County here, you've heard already, I'm sure many, many times, we have almost 11,000 wells. We deal with oil and gas every day in the planning world. Our counterparts, these ones are certainly noteworthy. You heard a lot from Weld County. These are the other counties in the state that have upwards of 3,000 plus wells. To note, the remainder of the state only makes up about 7,000 wells in total. So we and Weld County certainly carry the brunt of that. What we don't regulate the wells themselves. So your well pads that you have in your site, we don't regulate those. And in that, I think is a lot different between us and what some of the other Front Range communities are taking a look at. So I thought that was important context. Again, this isn't the entire Garfield County, but gives you a good feel of where a lot of these wells are located. Some of them are certainly in more populated areas, which certainly adds a level of complexity to dealing with them. So what we do regulate, obviously we're not talking about the wells, wellheads, the actual drilling and production techniques, but we do look at compression, we do look at water impoundments or water storage, whatever you might call them, our pits and ponds. We look at pipelines, housing, injection wells, as well as other kind of tanks and tank battery farms. And so this is our lovely land use code. This is what drives our everyday practice. I'm sure the planners in the room know what these things look like. I was going to offer Mike King, if he wants to take this to Botswana or Chile, he can do that. It's beautiful, don't you think? But it really ends up giving us on a day-to-day basis really kind of this almost bingo game. We say, okay, what zoning category you're in? What use are you? Oh, look, you're a permitted use. Or hey, you're a limited impact use. So it does provide a lot of predictability in what someone has to do. But there are challenges with that, and I want to save that kind of thought for at the end, because I think that this doesn't necessarily get out the size, the scale, the proximity, the intensity. It really groups our uses into very broad, generalized categories. Though the uses themselves may be very specific, it doesn't talk about how does this impact people, which are really generally our largest concerns, as well as the environment. So these are all things on the list on your left, my right. You've got centralization, injection wells, pipelines, water storage, hydraulic fracturing, especially our remote surface locations. These are all things that I want to talk about specifically in the world of water management techniques that we're seeing and how we've responded to them at the county level, and I should say are currently working on responding to some of them as well. Centralization. I'm sure all of you are seeing this in counties that have, or communities that have oil and gas. In its most simplistic forms, this is what we used to see here in the slide. We used to see a well pad, and it had several well heads, and it might have some tanks for condensate and some dehy units or dehydration units on the site. And it was relatively benign. We were very used to seeing these kind of things out around the county all over the place. But what happens, and excuse these very crude images, but I think you get it. Oops. This was our well right here, our well pad, and you have your little blue stars here, are your well heads, and you've got, oh, this keeps advancing on me. Oops, or it just is on my slide, sorry. You've got your tanks and your dehy units, or these little yellow boxes, really meant to be illustrative here. What we saw is that in our area, we were having industry actually pulling off some of these other accessory uses and facilities off the kind of traditional pad. They may be on the other side of the road. They may be adjacent to the pad, but not actually on the pad anymore. And then you have your classic case of centralization. So you have a number of actual smaller pads, reduced in size, that have wells on them, but then you're actually pulling off these other accessory and appurtenant facilities and actually putting them on a whole nother site. This may be across the street, this may be a fair distance away, mile plus. And so the county, again, keeping in mind that the original pad is a by right pad, said, what the heck do we do with this other type of facility, the centralized facility, and how big, most importantly, can that get? And so, as David alluded, we spent a fair chunk of time with a number of our industry representatives trying to figure out how big can that get, and is it in the county's best interest to actually regulate this typically oil and gas drilling production facility that is now different. It looks and feels different. It could have potentially different impacts. And so we at the county level said, yes, we do think that there may be some need to regulate this. But we spent a lot of time, again, figuring out how big can this get and how big should it get in the county without having some level of review. And I will save you on the specific details, but ultimately what we came to, I think, as David represented in the very first part of the introduction today, is that we all left the room saying we don't really like it, but we can live with it. And ultimately rewrote a part of our county code to address the size and scale issue related to centralization. The next topic is injection wells. This has been a challenging one. This is an image of the injection wells here in Garfield County. We, as early as 2013, actually started regulating these. So as early as 2013. So just for a couple of years, we really have taken, at the county level, the decision forward that we were going to start regulating injection wells. This has been, I think, a challenge for the county in the sense that, one, we already have injection wells and have had them in operation here for a number of years. But as you know, there has been some increased concern about what injection does, this thing called induced seismicity, which, don't ask me, I'm a planner, I'm not that smart, I'm not sure exactly what that means, or how to tell our constituents how to respond appropriately to them. It's actually been really interesting looking at injection wells because it puts the planner, and I think our elected officials, in a really hard place to say, we're dealing with these surface issues, but they're directly related to a subsurface impact. And should we be regulating them, and how? Like I said, we are regulating them, but certainly are challenged with some of those other issues that we as planners don't usually deal with. Again, earthquakes, not usually in the planning book. Interestingly enough, I thought this was actually really telling for Garfield County. So this is obviously an image of a hydraulic fracturing site. These are wells that are actually being fractured on here, and I guess I kind of gave it away with putting a big red circle around it, but interestingly enough, the only thing that we regulate on this entire site is actually that injection well, which you can see is in that small house on the very far corner of the pad. So again, kind of looking for, I guess, consistency in regulations, but also just comparative about what we are regulating, and maybe asking the county to some degree, and we should all be doing this, is why do we regulate certain things and not others. Pipelines, again, really important to what you're doing with water management and different water management techniques. This is a map. It's a horribly ugly map in my opinion. Don't tell our GIS guys that. But the purple, and it's again meant to be broad brush here, but the purple lines on this map are all of our pipelines in the county. Lots and lots and lots of pipelines, and I guarantee you this is nowhere near the actual amount of pipelines that we have. Interestingly enough, the county does regulate pipelines. We've been regulating them for quite some time under SUP provisions as well as our current code. We did a major overhaul of that in 2004, and then revamped those regulations in 2008. Now the interesting thing is that out of all of those pipelines you see on this map, we only have 72 permitted pipelines. So there's lots of things in this, or lots of pipelines in the county that don't require a permit. So kind of interesting, especially when you're dealing with a public that's concerned about pipeline integrity, leakage, how it relates especially to things like water movement and management. How is water getting from a specific well pad site, conveying produced water potentially to ponds, injection wells, and so forth. Lovely shot of some pipelines, surface and some soon to be subsurface. The next one that we have been spending a fair bit of time on is actual water impoundments. We do regulate water impoundments. We call these pits and ponds. This is actually pulled right from the state's website. Gives you an idea of how many pits and ponds we have, a fair number. You can see some are active, closed, and unknown, and maybe someone from COGCC can tell me what unknown is. I don't know, but they're on the map. But again, a relatively intensive use here in the county. This is what they look like. They can be tanks, they can be pits, they can be ponds, they can have fresh water, they can have produced water. But certainly a concern for a number of citizens, as well as I think on the environmental end of what's going on with these pits and ponds. We call them impoundments. So one of the challenges, and I'll talk about it here more specifically, is just how and why do we regulate these types of impoundments? I guess, again, a question maybe more rhetorical at this point. But, you know, what is it that is of concern to these? Does it matter what we're using that water for ultimately, or does it matter what kind of water? Is it fresh or produced, and should we be regulating them differently? Hydraulic fracturing, really water intensive use. Obviously, we don't regulate hydraulic fracturing in and of itself. But what we do regulate is actually the remote surface location. Wait, I take that back. We do not regulate the remote surface location. We've been having a discussion on whether we would regulate some of the pits or ponds related to that. But here's, again, a simple crude diagram of how the remote fracturing location works. The yellow is meant to illustrate your tanks or pit or pond. And then you've got your well heads out there and other locations that you're actually actively fracking. Again, typically we've seen in Garfield County a variety of tanks, tank batteries that are pulled out for the actual fracking process, temporary nature. And I brought this one up. This is actually a current conversation that we're having with our industry is, are these pits and ponds actually the same as, and do they function at the same level, and do they have the similar impacts as fracking tanks? And again, the question is yet to be answered. Our board actually, I think, looks at this coming up on Monday again. But the point here being is that we are in the process of continually trying to keep up with where industry is going. So again, historically, fracking happened from tanks that you put on these pads. Industry has shifted, or at least some of our industry has shifted and said, you know what, there's other ways to do this, and they may actually be better ways to do this because of reduction in impacts or cost for infrastructure and so forth. And so the point of all of these different scenarios and looking at all these different types of kind of water management, I guess, specific techniques is really that when there's changes, it's incredibly hard for us to modify our code or revise that code. And this is one of the, I think, maybe inherent challenges of having a land use code that is not necessarily written in stone, but you do want it to have some regulatory certainty. But we spend at Garfield County, and I wouldn't even try to guess the hours that we at staff level have spent, but that also means that industry is spending a huge amount of time and resources trying to not just navigate our code, but also try to work with us to revise this code. You can see all of these lists right here. The bold ones are the kind of water-related changes we made to our code, and the other ones are other kind of industry-driven changes. But we spend a ton of time and resources trying to modify our code just to keep up. This isn't getting ahead here, at least I don't think so. This is just keeping up. So this is industry saying, hey, we've been doing something differently, and it may have been happening for some time, but we want to be on the up and up, so how do we work with you to address this issue? And so I'll leave you maybe more, like I said, of a kind of rhetorical set of questions here than anything. I think that there are ways that we can keep our codes fluent to really try to keep up with industry. And I would encourage you all, especially on the planning end and the regulatory end, to really think about how we can be flexible, especially as a planner in the planning profession, where we really, I think, are encouraged, or almost required, I should say, to have and provide regulatory certainty, but also really want to have the flexibility and the ability to look at things on a case-by-case nature, should it warrant that conversation. I think, secondly, how do we exchange information in a meaningful way with our industry partners? So it's not me, planner, sitting in the room with me planning boss and deciding how we might proceed. How do we actually encourage our industry representatives to come to us and say, hey, we're looking at doing something differently. How might you regulate that? I certainly haven't ever been in a room where industry said, hey, we're doing something differently, let me tell you about it, and how do you want to regulate us? That doesn't happen, at least not in my world. But how do we at least move that ball forward a little bit and having that conversation when, as I think David said in the introduction here, technology changes so rapidly that if we're looking at very specific uses in our code, we have maybe been outdated long ago, not just your 70s code that you had on the books. It was your yesterday's code, or the 3 months ago, or the 3 years ago code that you still had in your books. I think maybe as equally important is how are we best expedient at reviewing these changes in our land use code? So again, we're hamstrung as planners in Garfield County by a land use code that says you have 30 days for noticing your planning commission, you have 30 days for noticing your board of county commissioners. There are certain things that have to happen along the way in order for you to meet that schedule. At a minimum, it takes us 6 months to get through our code. I would press us all, especially as planners and electeds, to say, is there a better way to do that? Is there a way that we can be more expedient in responding to and working with industry so that we can move that ball forward on their needs as well as ours to work within our legal framework that we need to as planners. The other kind of notes I want to say is the idea that maybe looking at the Euclidean zoning pattern that I think most of our counties have may not be the most appropriate way. You know, I listened to what Matt Lepore said earlier today, looking at scale, proximity, intensity. Is there a way in which a county may or a municipality may look at those 3 elements of a use to say, is there a better way to look at these types of oil and gas activities through the lens of scale, proximity, and intensity? And Matt, good luck defining what large-scale facilities is. That will be fun. I think that's all. I really kind of want to just leave you with those, I guess, last points about, what can we be doing in our codes today to make sure that we can and have been adequately prepared to work meaningfully with our industry partners to make sure that our codes function to the degree we can. And I don't know that I have the perfect silver bullet today. I will share that my experience working with our industry partners here has been great, absolutely. They've been fabulous partners, but it is a very intensive and difficult process sometimes. And thank goodness we have an industry here that's willing to come to the table and have those conversations. But that may not always be the case, especially in some other communities. So with that, I'll close and open for questions.
Okay.